So to do our guest speaker introductions, I'm going to turn it over to our President-elect, Shelley Clark.
Good evening, everyone. As you may or may not know, a long budget session is now underway at the Indiana State Legislature, and the decisions and votes that are made there directly impact our public schools. So to help us kick off our Parent Council Public Policy Committee efforts and to help parents take action on their own and get involved in public policy, we have invited two special guests this evening. Our speakers tonight are Dontanya S. Batts and Joel Hand from the bipartisan Indiana Coalition for Public Education. First, we'll hear from Joel Hand, who serves as ICPE's General Counsel and Lobbyist on specific education proposals and specific bills that are currently in play at the legislature. And then after that, ICPE board member Dontanya Batts will share her perspective on how some of these specific education policies can impact our communities. And if you're unfamiliar with the Indiana Coalition for Public Education, the vision of the bipartisan Indiana Coalition for Public Education is to advocate for high quality, equitable, well-funded public schools for all children that are subject to democratic oversight by their communities. And you can learn more about this public education advocacy group if you go to their website at indianacoalitionforpubliced.org, and I will also drop that link in the chat. And then as we get further along, I will also drop a link for a sign up for getting parents involved in public policy. And there's lots of things you can choose to get involved with if you so desire. So with that, we'll start off with Joel. And let's see if I can see you. Welcome, Joel.
Good evening. Thank you very much for having me be with you this evening with the Washington Township Parents Council. It's always my honor and pleasure to address this group. It seems like every year at about this time when the legislature is just kind of getting underway. So thank you once again for inviting me. I have been following a number of bills, actually over 130 bills that directly impact K through 12 education that have already been filed and published before the Indiana General Assembly. This is not necessarily an abnormally high number for a budget year. In fact, it's about on par with what we normally see. But it is obviously a rather daunting task to follow that many bills. The good news is that not all of them will get hearings and not all of them will go very far in the political process. The bad part of that is that a lot of the bills that we might think would be good bills are the ones more likely probably to die given the current state of the General Assembly. But I've narrowed it down to 9 bills in each chamber, so 9 House bills and 9 Senate bills that I'd like to talk with you briefly about tonight. And hopefully I can do that in relatively rapid fire fashion. I don't want to cut into Dontanya's time or the rest of the meeting more than absolutely necessary. So let's jump right in, shall we? As you have heard, this is a budget session. We write a new state budget every 2 years in odd numbered years, and that state budget applies then for the following 2-year period. And this is critically important for K through 12 education. The state budget, approximately half of what we as a state spend in our budget goes to K through 12 education. Sadly, over the years, we've seen that approximate 50% of the state budget pie get whittled away by other non-public education entities, whether we're talking about charter schools or vouchers or innovation network schools, what have you. There are now a whole host of other pieces that get taken out of that pie that come out of the portion that applies to K through 12 education. So no longer can we say that public schools receive approximately 50% of the state education K through 12 budget. That is a limited number or a limited percentage to less than 50% go to true public K through 12 education. But as a budget year, House Bill 1001, that is the number one or the highest priority bill in the House of Representatives. All of their bills are 4 digits, and the lowest one or the highest priority bill is House Bill 1001, 1001. Every other year during the budget year, the budget is House Bill 1001. It is the most important bill which will go through the General Assembly. And right now, we don't have a lot of details fleshed out about the proposal that is coming from the House of Representatives. They won't actually release their proposed budget until a little bit later on in the session. But we do have the governor's budget, which was just released the other day. And it actually has some good news in it for public schools. Under Governor Holcomb's proposal, it would provide an increase in K through 12 ADM funding of 2% in the first year of the biennium and 1% in the second year of the biennium. So that's certainly a positive start, particularly in light of what we were expecting maybe just 2 or 3 months ago. With respect to the pandemic, I think we all know and can appreciate that state revenues have been down substantially. Tax collections are down. Tax revenue is down substantially. People are not eating out. They're not driving as much. The economy has definitely had a downturn. But the good news is that it has not turned down nearly as much as we expected. The third quarter for 2020 was much stronger than anticipated, and that resulted in a much more rosy fiscal forecast that was put out at the end of 2020 than what we were anticipating. And that has emboldened the governor and some legislative leaders to suggest that not only will they be able to hold the line on K through 12 education funding, but they might actually be able to increase K through 12 education funding, which would certainly be a welcome development and not expected if you go back a few months ago, what we were expecting as a result of the pandemic. But we don't have a lot of details fleshed out yet about the budget. That'll come later on in the session, but that will certainly be a bill to watch very carefully and very closely. The last thing I'm going to say about the budget bill is that because this bill is so large and because so many different pieces of legislation impact the state's budget, it becomes what we refer to as a Christmas tree bill. In other words, if a piece of legislation hasn't made it all the way through the process, but legislators still want to pass it at the last minute, it can get added on as an ornament to the budget bill through an amendment, and that thereby completes the analogy of it being a Christmas tree bill. All of these other bills that don't quite make it get added on as ornaments at the end, which makes it very difficult to follow all of those changes, some of which come truly in the last hour of the session as we get down towards the end of April, and we've seen that time and time again. So this is a bill certainly to keep your eye on, and as you hear and see communications from our group or other groups about the budget bill, or as you talk to legislators, make sure you're always asking a lot of good questions about that bill. Okay, enough about the budget for now. I'll move on and talk about House Bill 1002, the second highest priority bill for the General Assembly, or at least the House of Representatives this year. This is a civil immunity related to COVID-19, and many folks within public schools have been asking to be included within the immunity for COVID-related issues, so that it would allow school corporations to have immunity from being sued by parents, being sued by staff members, faculty members, community members who feel like they may have contracted COVID or had COVID-related symptoms as a result of being in contact with the school. That bill has been fast-tracked. It's already had its hearing in the House Ways and Means Committee, and likely would have had its hearing this week had the General Assembly been in session. Some of you may have heard, others may not have. The General Assembly actually canceled all activities for the week because of fears about there being protests and possible riots around the state capitol related to the national inauguration. But none of that fortunately took place. There was a small protest from what I understood last week and saw photographs of, but nothing really developed this week. And that really pushes things back a week. So I expect that the civil immunity bill in the House will probably go to second reading and perhaps even third reading in the House next week. Once it goes to third reading, that's when it finally would get passed and moved over to the Senate. So that's a very fast-track bill. House Bill 1003 is the next bill I'll talk about over on the House side. This is state tuition support. And this is the bill that has been crafted in the House to try to address the issue of schools providing virtual or online instruction as a result of the pandemic. Because I know that you as parents are very actively engaged and you follow the media closely, I'm sure you're well aware that there's been this controversy about whether or not schools would actually receive full funding for providing instruction that was something other than in person. We had legislators sending out letters last year indicating that the way state law worked, and this was just factual, that if there wasn't a change in the law, that schools would stand to lose up to 15% of their ADM money, the amount of money per student that a school corporation receives from the state, if they were providing 50% or more of virtual instruction. Well, House Bill 1003 corrects that or changes that by changing the definition of virtual instruction. The baseline of this bill is that if this bill passes, and this bill has also been fast-tracked and is moving its way quickly through the legislature, will probably also get second and third reading next week, then it would allow for school corporations to receive 100% of ADM funding, regardless of how much education was done in person versus virtual, for the current school year only. This does not extend beyond the 2020-21 school year. It's limited only to the current school year. So if there is an interruption related to the pandemic or anything else in the fall of 2021 or at any point thereafter, this bill would not have any impact on it. All right, House Bill 1005 is the fourth bill I'd like to talk about, and this just got released last week, so it's still relatively new, and it is a very broad, sweeping bill. It has a number of impacts on public schools as well as on private voucher programs, and it also creates something called an Indiana Education Savings Account, which essentially allows for taxpayer funding of homeschooling. So House Bill 1005 first creates this Indiana Education Savings Account. And for those of you who have heard my presentation in years past, we know that we've had other bills been presented in years past that created these education savings accounts, but they never passed. They also never received nearly as high of a priority. This is one of the House Republicans' top 5 priority bills, hence the House Bill 1005 designation. And we've been told by Chairman Boehning, who is the chair of the House Education Committee, that this bill will pass, that they have more than enough votes to get it out of the House, which is kind of frightening in my estimation. The Education Savings Account program, as I said, essentially would establish a fund that allows students who are with a disability or designated as special education, or are children of a parent who is in the armed services, to receive funds that would otherwise go to the public school to use for their own educational materials. They can use it for private school tuition, but they do not have to use it to attend a public school. They do not have to use it to attend a private school. They can decide to homeschool themselves, and they will receive the funds that would otherwise go to the public school. In addition to that provision, it also would allow for there to be a change to the Choice Scholarship Program. That's our private school voucher program in the state of Indiana, by changing the eligibility requirements. Right now, eligibility for a voucher or a choice scholarship is capped at 200% of the reduced lunch income level. And this would raise that eligibility to 225% of the reduced lunch eligibility level. So it would increase the number of households who would be eligible for choice scholarships, and would make conforming amendments to it as well. Now, for me, one of the things to always look at when considering any piece of legislation, particularly one that's as broad and sweeping as this, is to look at something called the Fiscal Note, which is prepared by the Legislative Services Agency that goes along with the bill. So for those of you who actually get on the General Assembly website, don't just simply look at the bill. Please also look at the fiscal impact statement prepared by LSA, because that's where we really get the details about what the bill will do, as well as how much it's going to cost us as taxpayers. When you look at the fiscal note under House Bill 1005, there's a breakdown of a number of different categories for additional costs that will be associated with this bill. With respect to the Indiana Education Savings Account program, that as it applies just to those special education students and the students of military families and also to foster children, they are estimating, and I would suggest this is probably a conservative estimate, that in fiscal year 2022, it would cost the state $64.9 million, in fiscal year 2023, $66.1 million, and they then list long-term, meaning years thereafter, at $68.2 million. That's based upon a lot of assumptions, certainly, but it is certainly an increase in state expenditures. Then on the Choice Scholarship Program expansion, for the expansion to the 225% of reduced lunch eligibility, that's just for fiscal year 2022, and it actually jumps to 300% of the eligibility for reduced lunch income. And so they are suggesting that that would cause an increase of state expenditures by up to $33.8 million in the first year, fiscal year 2022, and up to $31.4 million in fiscal year 2023. And then thereafter, long-term expansion beyond that would only be up to $15.5 million per year in addition. Honestly, in my mind, it doesn't make a lot of sense why those numbers would go down over time instead of up, because the eligibility increases over time. So you would think that that would increase expenditures on the part of the state. I'm going to have to dig into this a little bit further, as I'm sure many others are as well, to figure out how they're coming up with these numbers and these figures. But obviously, this cuts into further the amount of money that's available by the state to spend on K through 12 public schools. Don't forget, any money that comes out of the K through 12 budget that's allocated to choice programs, be they charters or voucher schools or homeschools, all comes out of the same budget that the public school funding comes out of. These are not separate line items. It all comes out of the same piece of the pie. Then in addition to that, it breaks it out separately, those students who would be switching from a traditional public school to a non-public school, an increased expense of up to an additional $35 million per year long-term. So that's on top of the other numbers. Then in addition to that, the number of students who would be switching from being homeschooled to receiving these education savings accounts, they estimate that at up to an additional 5.2 million per year in the long term. And then for the non-choice private schools, so there are some private schools that do not accept choice scholarships or vouchers, but they, under these education savings accounts programs, could still accept that as opposed to a voucher. That would cause a potential increase they're estimating long-term up to 4.8 million per year. So when you break all of that down, you've got some pretty substantial increases in state expenditures. And then when you look at the total loss of revenue for public schools over the course of time, long-term, they're suggesting that it would be a total of between $222 and $252 million per year that would be lost revenue to the public schools as a result of this bill. That's extraordinarily substantial. So when you compare that to Governor Holcomb's proposed increase in public school funding of about $370 million, you see that most of that is going to be eaten up by the expansion of choice programs. So there's not any real increase, or very much smaller increase, in true funding to traditional K through 12 public schools. So now I hope you see a little bit more about why I'm so concerned about this bill. But we'll move on from House Bill 1005. The next bill I'll talk about just very briefly is House Bill 1035. This is a bill from Representative Manning that would establish an English language learner or small grant program. Now, we've had a small schools grant program in the past that is a part of the state budget that allocates some additional revenue for small schools. But under this bill, not only would it continue to allocate some additional funding for small schools, but it would also allocate additional funds for any school corporations that have 1,000 or more pupils who are deemed eligible for the English language learner program. So that could obviously impact some relatively substantial urban school districts as well. And we even have a few more suburban or mid-sized districts, particularly around the South Bend Elkhart area, that would also qualify then for this English language learner grant program. So that's House Bill 1035. The sixth House bill that I'll talk about is another bill that deals with the voucher program. This is House Bill 1093. The House Bill 1005, the first one I talked about, was authored by Representative Bob Boehning, who's the chair of the House Education Committee. This bill, House Bill 1093, is authored by Representative Bob Cherry, who's from Greenfield. And this also would make changes to the eligibility requirements for the Choice Scholarship or Voucher Program. This doesn't have anything to do with education savings accounts. It just changes the eligibility for the Choice Scholarship Program. It does not raise it to that 300% level. It caps it at 250% of reduced lunch fee students. But the other important thing to know about House Bill 1093 is it does away with the various categories of vouchers. Under current law, we have a 50% voucher for higher income families, a 70% voucher for middle income families, and a 90% voucher for lower income families. Under House Bill 1003, everyone who receives a voucher would receive 90% of the ADM funding to go towards their voucher amount. So that's an important thing to note there. Obviously, a pretty high price tag with House Bill 1093. Now, a piece of legislation that's back to the positive side, House Bill 1137, which was filed by Representative Chris Campbell, would create a sales tax holiday. Many states around the country recognize a sales tax holiday as it applies to the sale of goods that are for families sending their children back to school. So this would apply to clothing and shoes and computers and school supplies, backpacks, for example. And that's what House Bill 1137 would do, is create a sales tax holiday for the week of August the 1st through August the 7th every year, and would include an elimination of sales tax on backpacks, school supplies, for any family who has a public or private elementary or secondary school student. Also would include a purchase of a computer if the computer is to be used by a student in a public or private elementary or secondary school. The computer sales price can also not exceed $500. So any amount over $500 you would be taxed on. House Bill 1186 is an important bill for many school corporations who have been taking advantage of the early graduation legislation that was passed a number of years ago. Right now in the state of Indiana, if a student completes their educational requirements before they reach the second semester of their senior year, they can actually graduate at the end of their fall semester of their senior year as an early graduate. The downside to that for school corporations is that means the student is in the seat when the spring count date comes in February. So the school corporation has lost out on the ADM funding that comes with that student for the second semester. That makes it really hard for school administrators to plan their budgets when they lose half of a student's tuition amount from the state at the semester. So House Bill 1186, which is also, interestingly, by Representative Bob Cherry from Greenfield, would then keep that student's ADM whole even if they graduate at semester, meaning that even if the student does graduate at semester, the school corporation would still receive the full ADM funding for that student as a way to recognize and reward not just the student, but really the school corporation for doing its job and assisting that student in being able to graduate early. So we see that as a very positive bill. I would also just mention that that bill has already received its first hearing this last week, and I expect that it will pass out of committee this coming week. It should have been on the calendar for this week to go for amend and vote before the House Ways and Means Committee. Ways and Means did not meet this week, so it'll be back up on the calendar we expect next week for amending and voting in House Ways and Means Committee. All right. The last House bill, the ninth House bill that I wanted to talk to you folks about this evening is House Bill 1267, which creates an education foundation tax credit. So many public school corporations around the state have had parents and community members come together to create an education foundation. And while you can receive a tax deduction currently for a donation to that type of a not-for-profit that goes to help support programs and endeavors on the part of the school, corporation, and their students and their faculty, this bill, House Bill 1267, would create or change that deduction to a tax credit. This bill was drafted and filed by Representative Carrie Hamilton, and it would allow for a taxpayer to receive a maximum of up to a $1,000 tax credit per single taxpayer, or $2,000 for a married couple filing a joint return. That also would be the greater of 10% of the school corporation's total, or the corporation's adjusted gross income, or $10,000 if the donation is made by a corporation rather than an individual. So we saw that as a positive bill as well. All right, I think that covers the education bills in the House that I wanted to bring to your attention. Let me flip through and make sure I didn't miss anything of great import. I think that should cover that. Now I'll move over to talk about the Senate bills. You're going to hear some similar concepts in the Senate, and that's common. Frequently, bills that are identical or virtually identical get filed in each chamber, one in the House, one in the Senate, just to make sure that they're covering their bases and that that concept has twice the opportunity to get passed. If both versions were to get passed by both chambers, then they would work it out in something called a conference committee toward the end of session. So let's start at the top here. Senate Bill 1 is the civil immunity related to COVID-19 that we saw in House Bill 1002. This is very similar language that was drafted in the Senate, and again provides immunity to, among other entities, school corporations related to the COVID-19 pandemic. Because it's so similar, I'm not going to spend any additional time on it here this evening, again in interest of time. Senate Bill 2, the second highest priority bill for the Senate, is funding for virtual instruction in public schools. This is very similar to House Bill 1003. There are a couple of very slight wording changes between 1003 and Senate Bill 2. Senate Bill 2 is authored by Senator Jeff Rotz, who's the chair of the Senate Education Committee, and it has already had its hearing in Senate Education. It should have passed out, or it did pass out of Education Committee and would be eligible for second and third reading this coming week when the legislature gets back into session. Again, I'm not going to spend any extra time on it since we've already talked about a very similar bill over in the House. Okay, the third bill in the Senate to talk about, which again is a positive bill, or at least we see it as a positive bill, is a tax credit for teacher classroom supplies. Presently, teachers can get a tax credit of up to $100 for expenditures that they have at on classroom supplies, and this would increase that amount from $100 to $500 per year. So a teacher who spends up to $500 can actually get a credit towards their tax return of up to $500 if this bill were to pass. This is Senate Bill 16. It was authored by Senator Lonnie Randolph. Senator Randolph is an attorney from up in Lake County, Indiana. And I will just say this legislation, or very similar legislation, has been proposed, I think, just about every budget year since I've been doing my lobbying work for the ICPE going back to 2011, and it hasn't passed yet. So I'll keep my fingers crossed and hope that maybe it gets a better opportunity this year, but let's not hold our collective breath, shall we? Okay, this is not a terribly important bill from my perspective, but I'll mention it just because it's another one of those bills that gets heard every year, and the debates sometimes become somewhat comical on it. But Senate Bill 52 for school curriculum would require school corporations, public and non-public schools, to require cursive writing. This is the infamous cursive writing bill. Currently, public schools are not required to teach cursive writing anymore, haven't been for a number of years. Senator Jean Lysing, who's down from the Greensburg area, every year files a cursive writing bill, compulsory cursive writing bill, and this is the bill this year, Senate Bill 52. The next bill that I'll talk about in the Senate that I do think is of some import is Senate Bill 212, which prohibits discrimination in charter schools. I think we've all probably seen news reports of discrimination that's taken place in voucher schools with respect to students of differing gender identity or faculty members who are in the LGBTQ community, resulting in faculty members being terminated and what have you. This bill, Senate Bill 212, which was filed by a new senator, Senator Shelley Yoder from Bloomington, would prohibit any discrimination in a charter school on the basis of gender identity or expression, marital status, race, creed, national origin, color, sex, or sexual orientation. So it extends those same protections that already exist in traditional public schools to the charter schools as well. I'd like to see that go a little bit further and also include the voucher schools, but one step at a time, I suppose. That bill has not yet received a hearing, and quite honestly, I don't expect it to, but it's nice that the bill like that has been proposed. Okay, the next bill to keep an eye on is Senate Bill 333, an Education Matters bill. We've heard for the last couple of years since the General Assembly has contemplated changing the elected superintendent of public instruction to an appointed Secretary of Education as appointed by the governor. We've heard that a part of this concept is to also combine a number of state entities. So right now we have a state board of education, we have a state charter school board, we have a governor's workforce cabinet, we have a number of these different entities. Senate Bill 333 would amend the membership of the State Board of Education and change the per diem amount, or the amount that they can receive for the days that they work on State Board of Ed matters. It would increase the number of appointees that the governor would have to the State Board of Education. And it also removes a provision that members of the governing body of a school corporation comprised of appointed members would also have a point of authority to approve a per diem rate. Although this is the current state of this bill, based upon some other pieces of legislation that are floating around out there and haven't yet quite made their way to the surface, I fully expect that this bill will become a vehicle to change the law as it relates to the State Charter School Board and the Workforce Development Council. This bill is authored by Senate Education Chairman Jeff Rotz. That means it's going to have a much greater chance of getting heard in the Senate Education Committee. Since he's the chairman, he can decide what bills to hear. So I expect this to become that vehicle bill. So keep your eye out for Senate Bill 333. The next bill I wanted to talk about in the Senate, Senate Bill 342, is another bill that proposes the creation of a tax credit for K through 12 education contributions. Under this bill, it would provide a 25% state tax credit to taxpayers that make a contribution directly to a public elementary school or public secondary school in Indiana, or to its foundation for a public elementary or secondary school. So very similar to the other bill. This is authored by Senator Brian Buchanan. Senator Buchanan's district includes most of Boone County, parts of Tippecanoe County, I think all the way up to White County, if I'm not mistaken. And he is on the Senate Education Committee. So again, I think that has a chance of being heard, although that bill was actually referred to the Senate Tax and Fiscal Policy Committee. It has not yet been scheduled for a hearing. Now, this is a bill that certainly will have great implications for IPS, but also could have implications on any school corporation that may have a vacant or underutilized building. This is Senate Bill 358, authored by Senator Linda Rogers, who is a senator from up in the South Bend area. This would create a new definition for a vacant or underutilized school building and mandate that beginning in 2022, that a school corporation that has a so defined vacant or underutilized school building within 60 days of the fall count for ADM, and that that building then being designated as being either underutilized or vacant, would have to report that underutilized or vacant building to the Department of Education, and then it would be subject to sale, to putting the building up to sale, unless the school corporation submitted a protest to the State Board of Education, basically spelling out why it was that they needed to be able to retain that building. So it's essentially a forced sale of these unused, underutilized buildings for large areas that are, or any district really that is going through a period of student decline, enrollment decline, can have really devastating effects. We'll see this hit very hard in urban areas. We'll see this hit very hard in some small and rural areas that are closing schools due to declining enrollment. And I expect a lot of opposition to this bill from the K through 12 public education community, at least as it's currently written. All right, the next bill to talk about, Senate Bill 372. It is entitled Various Education Matters, which is usually code for this includes a lot of stuff, so hold on. This bill is authored by newly elected Senator Fadi Kadora, who's there in your district, and it does a number of things. It changes the definition of an eligible child for purposes of the Early Education Grant Pilot Program. It would also address the issue of virtual instruction for determining state tuition support for the ADM, so similar to what we saw in Senate Bill 2. It would also provide that a school corporation's category or designation of performance for state accountability performance would not be any lower than what the school received in the 2019-2020 school year or the 2020-2021 school year. So you don't get penalized for your performance on assessments just because of the pandemic. Many school corporations around the state have been very fearful that student test scores are down substantially from back in the spring when testing was being undertaken despite the pandemic, or what testing may take place this spring with the pandemic still raging. And so this bill would protect school corporations from having any consequences for having lower student scores. So again, we think that's a good bill, and I think we'll very likely support that if that gets a hearing in the Senate Education Committee where it's been referred. The next bill that I wanted to talk about is something called the Indiana Personalized Education Grant Program. This is Senate Bill 412. And this is similar to an education savings account. It would allow that the parents of an eligible student or an emancipated student to establish an account in this program. It defines an eligible student as a student who has a disability who requires special education, a student who is in foster care, a student who is otherwise supervised by the Department of Child Services, and provides that an eligible student who has an account and attends a qualified school, which can include a public school, a private accredited school, or a private non-accredited school, would receive an annual grant amount equal to the ADM amount that would have otherwise gone to the public school. So this is basically a 100% voucher. Under the current voucher program, we have the 50%, 70%, and 90% levels. This is essentially a 100% voucher, and it doesn't even have to be used at an accredited school. A family could use it to go to a non-accredited non-public school, which roughly translates to a homeschool. They can use it to attend, to pay that tuition, or they can use it for any related educational expenses. Now, programs similar to this in other states have been subject to widespread abuse. We've seen some national news stories highlighting a family, I believe it was out of New Mexico, that received one of these education savings accounts and took the money and spent it on a trip to Disneyland for their family. They said it was an educational experience for their family because they'd never been there before, but that's the type of abuse that we've seen in these programs across the country. There have been other news stories detailing how families spend it on huge flat screen TVs and other very questionable items which had very limited to no educational value for the student. So that's another bill to watch. As I said earlier, Senator Buchanan is on the Senate Education Committee, and we've been hearing that Senator Rotz is likely to give that bill a hearing in Senate Ed before the end of the session. And then finally, the last bill that I'll talk about over on the Senate side is Senate Bill 413, also entitled Education Matters. This bill, which is authored by Senator Jeff Rotz, who's the chair of the Senate Education Committee, authorizes the board or a school corporation of a fiscal body in which a school corporation is located to adopt a resolution to transfer a share of the school corporation's operating funds from tax revenue to charter schools according to an allocation formula based upon the ADM of the charter school compared to the total ADM of the public school. Now, I think most of you were aware of legislation that passed last year that allows for a public school to share referendum funding with a charter school. This bill would be a step in the direction of mandating that the public school share referendum funding with a charter school. It also, in this bill, Senate Bill 413, would provide that any foster child would receive a choice scholarship or a voucher if they so chose. It also amends the maximum amount for a choice scholarship for every eligible voucher student to 90% of the state tuition support. So it would again do away with that 50% and 70% voucher level and just create an across the board 90% voucher level for all students. So this would be very regressive in terms of its impact on the community. It would give the same type of financial support to wealthy families as it would to impoverished families for that voucher. Then finally, there's a good part of the bill, hence the Education Matters. It covers the wide spectrum of things. This bill would also create a hold harmless, if you will, for school corporations for purposes of performance on statewide assessments for the 2020-2021 school year, as well as the 2019-2020 school year. So again, similar to Senator Fedora's bill, this would allow a school corporation to be able to retain the higher of their state performance assessment scores, the ABC letter grade, from the 2019-20 or 2020-21 school year, so that they were not held accountable and have consequences for school improvement that might apply if their scores went down dramatically. So that's a very quick overview of some 18, actually I think I covered 19 bills that we're going to be hearing this year in the session. And I know there have been a few questions pop up in the chat, so I'm happy to answer those now if you folks would like. Do you want me to access the chat and look at them myself?
I think maybe look at the chat.
Let's go back here.
And then we can certainly just, there are not so many people here that we could talk openly as well. Looks like there's full in the chat.
Okay, let me scroll down here. Okay, under first question, under Senate Bill 358, are only vacant school buildings at risk, or would this also affect property of a school district holds that has not yet been developed into a school building or a district facility? So the way that I read this bill, it would not apply to undeveloped property. So if a school corporation held, let's say, some vacant land that had not yet been developed, I don't believe that it would apply. I can look at the bill a little bit more closely to be sure about that, but I don't think that it would apply to vacant land, because it does make specific references throughout the bill to a vacant or underutilized building. Where I get concerned substantially about this bill, besides just the vacant buildings, are these quote unquote underutilized buildings. And we've seen a number of school districts throughout the state that, because of the way the law reads now and the allowing a charter school to buy up a vacant school building for $1 or for it to be sold to a voucher school for a below market value, we've seen a number of school districts that have undertaken the practice of then moving like their early childhood program into a larger building than what that would be necessary to hold. Or maybe they'll move their administrative offices or a portion of their administrative offices into an otherwise vacant building. Some school corporations have decided to do that for their career and tech ed programs, for example. They'll move that into an otherwise vacant building. So my real concern here is, how are they going to truly define that underutilized building? Is it going to be based upon a percentage of the building used? It's very unclear to me how that's really going to pan out. It would require the state board then to adopt rules associated with that and fleshing that out a little bit. So that could really put some school corporations in a bind at losing a number of buildings that were not used to full or close to full capacity. I would also honestly worry too about some small rural school districts that have seen substantially declining enrollment but have not been able to get community support for closing a building. This could then force those small school districts to lose a building that that local community might not want to close down if it just doesn't have enough students in it. So we would see that too. I hope that answered that question. Next question here. Are there any guardrails to prevent abuse like the trips to Disney? This is with the ESA proposals. Unfortunately, not in the bills that have been filed, or at least not ones that seem to have any teeth to them. I've heard rumors of, but have not yet seen, a letter that allegedly was written by a number of prosecutors from around the state expressing their concerns about education savings accounts over it being ripe for widespread abuse. I'm still trying to get my hands on that letter that was allegedly sent to legislators. But yeah, I think this is a very real concern that there really aren't any guardrails, and it would be almost impossible to enforce unless every single bill was having to go through the State Board of Accounts or the Treasurer's Office and be audited. And that's just not in any of the proposals as they stand right now. So the next question was about the hold harmless. Is there any appetite for just waiving testing this year? No, I can say there's absolutely zero appetite for that in either the Senate or the House majority caucuses. We've raised that, and when I say we, I mean myself and other public education advocates and lobbyists have raised that and advocated for that, and we've been met with a resounding brick wall no, that will not be considered by the legislature this year. And the next question, have we heard any noise from the federal level with the new administration regarding testing? So we have heard some noise, I'll just call it that, to pick up on the use of the term, that they may consider a waiver of accountability for spring testing, or a federal hold harmless, so to speak, under the federal accountability system. But I have not heard anything that I've found to be credible that would suggest that the Biden administration is going to waive testing requirements for the spring semester. Now, that could come to fruition, I don't know, but I've not heard any credible information to this point to that effect. Next question. Understanding we are dealing with supermajority, what is the most impactful action that we as parents can take? Talk to legislators. You've got to get the word out to legislators. You've got to organize, and you've got to get other people to speak up. The more individual voters and taxpayers that contact their legislators and tell them, hey, we don't like bill, you name it, 251 or whatever the bill may be, and here's why, the more of an impact that will have. I've talked to legislators, many legislators over the years, who say, if I get a constituent contact me about a bill, I'll listen to it, I'll hear what they have to say, but that's probably not going to impact my vote. If I get letters or communications from 10 or 12 constituents, I'm going to pay more attention to that. If I start getting communications from dozens and dozens of constituents, I'm really going to pay attention to that and consider how that might affect my vote. Now, saying that, that's what legislators have told me. I'm not sure that I always believe that it has that much of an impact, because they are so controlled by their House or Senate leadership. We've heard stories, confidential stories from legislators who've said, I had my committee chairmanship threatened if I voted a certain way on a certain bill or voted against a certain bill. I've been threatened with having my seat changed or moved in the chamber if I voted a certain way on a certain bill. So those leaders within the caucuses have a tremendous amount of power. So I would say two things. One, always, always, always reach out to your own individual legislator, but don't stop there. Also reach out to the members of the committee that's hearing a particular bill. And probably even more importantly, you need to be sending your messages to the Speaker of the House, to the President Pro Tem of the Senate, and make sure that they are hearing you loud and clear. And the more of you that band together and organize your thoughts and your actions, the more impact it's going to have. We're very much in a David and Goliath type of situation when it comes to trying to protect and preserve public education in Indiana, especially these last 10 or so years. We are up against just a monumental task of trying to help and preserve and protect public schools. So we've all got to be David. We've all got to be out there with our slingshots, just hurling stone after stone after stone, trying to chip away at these steamroller efforts that are being undertaken. Let's see, next question. Oh, committee hearings. How will committee hearings work this year, and how will us ordinary parents be able to participate in the past, as we have in the past? Well, with the pandemic, the legislature has changed the way in which they're accepting testimony on bills. Most committees are accepting written testimony from the general public. I'm not sure how much impact that will really have, but you can certainly do that. You've been able to do that in the past. It hasn't been utilized as much, but you can always submit written testimony to be considered by the legislature. I'll also say written testimony is pretty easy to ignore too. You just hit delete or don't read it. You can also testify in person, but what in person means differs a little bit depending upon the committee. There are some committees that are actually having you come into the committee hearing room itself. I will tell you that I've already testified in a few different committees, and so far I've been pleasantly surprised by the precautions that they've taken. In the Senate, for example, when I testified in the Senate Education Committee, they had us who were testifying in a different room from where the committee members were meeting, and we were being broadcast in on a closed circuit or a Zoom into the rest of the committee. Over in the House side, I testified in the House Ways and Means Committee as well as House Education, and there they had us in the same room as the committee members because the committee was meeting in the full House chamber, so they can all spread out pretty far. They didn't, unlike in the Senate where they have plexiglass barriers set up very nicely that provides an added layer of protection. The House chamber didn't have the plexiglass, but everyone was definitely more than 6 feet away. I didn't really feel any great concerns, and they were wiping down the podium and the microphone in between speakers to help with any concerns about the spread of COVID. Nonetheless, I can certainly understand and appreciate and have some trepidation myself about going down to the State House. I will also just say that in my experience so far, the crowds at the State House have been much less. In fact, I would call it, and did call it to my wife, a virtual ghost town. The first day I went down to testify, there was hardly anybody there. And that's largely because, number one, there weren't that many committee meetings. And number two, most of the workers in the building aren't there. Pretty much all of state government is working remotely if it can. There are very few state employees who are actually physically present in the State House. Even the Legislative Services Agency attorneys and drafters are working remotely if they are not going to be in person for a particular committee hearing on a given day. They've been told that they can stay home and work from home, which is a huge change from the past. Those poor folks work sometimes 20 to 22-hour days during the legislative session. I really have a great deal of empathy for them. But many of them are working from home if they don't have a committee that's in session that particular day. Okay, next question here. It looks like it has to do with charter schools. Charter schools are increasingly being referred to as school corporations or even school districts in IDOA statements and on the IDOA in-view database for parents. And yet I would guess that the bills are still being written to make distinctions between the two. As of right now, yes, although I did hear last week or maybe the week before when discussing a particular piece of legislation that that particular legislator had been given the advice that under that particular section of the code, when they had drafted and used the term school corporation, that they were told by LSA that that did include charter schools. So it may require some really careful examination of all the various parts of the Indiana code that refer to charter schools as to whether or not they're included within that definition of a school corporation or not. Apparently, at least some LSA attorneys believe that the term school corporation does include a charter school already. I've not personally interacted with that in my work as an attorney, but apparently that's the view of at least some LSA attorney out there. Okay, I think I covered all the questions that I saw there. If anyone has anything else?
I don't think so. Thank you, Joel, for that extensive list. And I know you said there's not even all of them at all.
Just a small fraction.
Well, thank you. And I'm going to drop in the chat a link for a Google form that people can use to sign up to participate in any way they want, whether it's simply to say, I'll make a phone call, I'll write a postcard, I'll go testify, whatever people are comfortable with. We've got an option on the form. So I will go ahead and drop that there. And then we'll also probably put that on social media as well as maybe even our website. So
great, thank you.
all right, well then